June 6, 1944. Dawn at an observation post above Vierville-sur-Mer. Pre-dawn, the air above Vierville-sur-Mer tastes of salt and cold, an iron chill that bites through the wool of a man's greatcoat and settles into the bone. Through a narrow, slitted aperture cut into concrete, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter breathes shallow, trained breaths. He is 32, sleeves threadbare at the cuffs, cheeks hollowed by a year of poor rations and older winters. The wind lifts the coarse hair at his temple. The binoculars are an old pair of Zeiss. The lenses are fogged at the edges from his damp glove. From this bunker, sunk hard into a chalky bluff and wired to the regimental command net, Richter has a view that is supposed to be reassurance. 100 meters of open sea, a long near horizon that, for months, his unit has measured and mapped into routine. It is just after 5. The world is muffled under a low gray ceiling. The channel sits like a sheet of pewter, calm enough to lull the most restless watchman into the belief that nothing larger than a fishing smack will break its surface. Men move like ghosts behind him. Loader sergeants checking rounds, a radio operator absently tracing the phone cord with grease-dark fingers. The bunker smells of coal smoke, machine oil, and the iron tang of nerves. Richter is not given to hyperbole. He has learned exactness on the Eastern Front. How to pace the strip of light down a slope and know if a formation will break. How to count the beats between engine notes and know the make of a vehicle. His regiment is the 372nd Infantry Division. Its name is on maps and whispered in briefings by officers who do not flatter. Its commander, General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, has been given the hard task of tamping strength into a long, thin line along Normandy's bluffs. Rommel has been here too. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's inspection in the weeks before has left its mark in fear and iron. Poles of Rommel asparagus planted on beaches, concrete poured into lethal little mouths called pillboxes. The Atlantic Wall was a promise of security in Berlin's rhetoric. Up close, it is a set of fragile machines and human hands trying to look permanent. Richter sweeps the horizon with the binoculars because that is what he must do. At first there is nothing unusual. The line where sea meets sky, a strip of pale water. Then, like an error that corrects itself into revelation, the line resolves. Not into single ships, but into a dense scatter, a mottled, moving black on the water's skin. He blinks, he rubs his cheek. The shapes multiply. Landing craft, low and square. Transports, long and hulking. Destroyers and cruisers and the great silhouettes of battleships. The silhouettes cluster where no human logic said they should. The sea is not empty. It is full. For a single unmoored instant, Richter's training scatters. He tries to fit what he sees into the catalog of intelligence reports and maps he has learned to trust. He finds no match. Not 3,000 vessels. Not a reconnaissance raid. There are too many to count. The mass presses the horizon flat, and the mass becomes a kind of impossible geometry. Ships press together like a city at sea. It is a sensation that goes beyond facts, a physical presence of resources that seems to displace the old metrics of warfare. He reaches for the telephone. His fingers move with the quick competence of habit. Observation Post 4 to Regimental HQ, he says, and his voice is even because he must make it so. The reply is routine, laced with the complacency of men whose maps have run clear of surprises. Reports of small craft only. Maintain watch. Richter's throat tightens. He forces himself calmer, tries another line. The man on the other end hears the words, hears the insistence, almost hysteria, and asks about weather, about storms, about mistaken squalls. Richter says none of that. He says he sees the sea filled with ships, thousands of them. He is told to stand by. There is a fault line here between what is planned and what is arriving. For months, Allied planners have perfected deception. Operation Fortitude and 1,000 small lies that have persuaded German high command to expect the main invasion at Pas de Calais. Rommel's focus is on beaches that make logical sense for an assault across the shortest channel crossing. His defensive pastries, barbed poles, mined shallows, hedgerow pillboxes inland, reflect that heavier expectation. Normandy, to Berlin's strategic map, is a distraction. The 352nd, however, has been asked to hold a seam in the map. Omaha. Its men are a mixture. Veterans who survived the East, conscripts still boys in uniform, and civic reservists who smell of small towns more than battle. Their positions are solid, but they are not everywhere. The wall is patched with the improvisations of fatigued engineers. Back in the slit, Richter hears the faintest throb growing. An organic sound that rises into a mechanical roar. It is engines and then more engines. The ships do not scatter when shells whip overhead from batteries along the coast. They simply continue. Farther still, the first cues of aircraft arrive. High, methodical silhouettes blotting out the gray. Richter senses a collapse of categories. The sea is a mass, the air an ocean. The defensive framework that had been allowed to ossify in German planning. Timelines for reinforcement, expectations of bombardment and surprise. Strains like a wire under heat, he issues orders anyway. The discipline of habit is a weapon. Shells are readied, fuses checked, the heavy barrels elevated toward the mass on the water. For a soldier like Richter, there is relief in work. The paralysis of disbelief gives way to the instinct that has kept men alive for decades. Do your job and measure its effects. The initial salvos go out. Concentrated, precise. Shrapnel whistles across waves. For a moment, there is triumph. A destroyer reels, smoke blooms, men cheer in the bunker at the sight of a kill. But the cheering is a small sound under a greater machine. The formation reorganizes. Gaps close. The ocean is a conveyor, and the sea pays no heed to singular sinkings. The first real response from the Allied fleet is not confusion, but industry. Big guns on battleships at sea return fire in thunderous, measured detonations that seem to split Richter's horizon into staccato flashes. The shore itself begins to move. Artillery strikes tear at the landscape, concrete spits and crumbles under meteor impacts. The bunker trembles with each blow. Suddenly the Atlantic wall's neat geometry, flat faces, calculated arcs of fire, becomes a ragged thing of dust and ash. In the span of these minutes, a different arithmetic asserts itself. Not the accuracy of a single gun, but the capacity to replace guns, to move men in numbers, to sustain an assault across weeks. Richter, pressed close to his observation slit, understands the scale as a moral fact. He looks up at the sky and counts planes, token after token of numerical superiority. Airframes that will strangle any German attempt to move reserves. He thinks of tanks, of Tigers and Panthers, the finest blades of German industry. But he also thinks of the Sherman, the American factory tank that can be produced by the thousand. The war has tilted, not by treachery or lack of courage, but by sheer output. The first wave hits. Higgins craft, LCVPs cut their ramps. Men pour into the surf. Machine gun fire from bunkers rakes the surf and takes a grim toll. From Richter's eye, the most terrible scene is not the shattering of flesh. It is the realization that the tide of material cannot be stemmed by the force of a few strong points. The naval armada keeps delivering. The factories keep turning. The air keeps clearing the sky. The Atlantic wall is tested and its seams begin to show. The fall of the Bluff. From observation post to ruptured line, the concussive roar never really stops. It deepens into a sustained mechanical insistence that eats at hearing and patience. Richter feels it in his molars and the soles of his boots. The beach below, a narrow strip hemmed by jagged concrete slits and barbed wire, becomes a theater of small, savage combats. Men in olive drab surge forward, only to be beaten back into the surf by a synchronized machine of metal and ordnance. For every assault wave pinned down, another rides the swells and hits elsewhere. Where German fire is concentrated and disciplined, for an instant the attackers are thrown into disorder. Where there are gaps, where a hedgerow shields a flank or a patch of unmined sand gives temporary purchase, the Allies exploit it with brutal efficiency. Richter's battery is hit. The first strike is a long-range shell from a battleship that detonates on the slope above the bunker, throwing chalk and concrete into the air like eldritch snow. Men on the parapet are wounded by flying shrapnel. Telephone lines flash, die, and then sputter. Command communications, so vital for coordinated counterattacks, begin to unravel. In the chaos, local initiative becomes crucial. Corporals and sergeants who can improvise signals and move ammunition by hand fill the void left by cut lines. Richter watches a corporal, Hauptfeldwebel Erich Baumann, a veteran of previous campaigns, organize a human chain to pass rounds under fire from the resupply point to the guns. The image is the primal soldier's scene. Muscle and will bridging the gap technology has left open. Yet the strategic reality presses in. Orders that would have once been routine. Mobilize Panzerreserve, coordinate Luftwaffe sorties, either do not come or arrive laced with qualifiers and delays. Hitler's direct control over the armored reserves and the chaotic state of the Luftwaffe command mean that mobile counterattacks cannot be launched with the speed the situation requires. Even where units are ordered forward, they are often attacked en route by Allied fighters and fighter bombers that have air superiority. The 21st Panzer Division, The only nearby formation with the capacity for a swift armored counterstroke is delayed and then mauled by air attacks as it attempts to deploy. Richter watches the horizon for the silhouette of tanks that may never appear. The absence is a fact that weighs more than any single shell. On the beach, individual acts of courage stack up against an industrial tide. Small groups of soldiers find ways onto bluffs, crawl through hedgerows, and brief ad hoc units of engineers attempt to cut gaps through wire and obstacles. The Allied naval guns, however, do not simply pound targets at random. Spotters in the air and on fast craft call corrections to the big guns, and the concentrated fire begins to neutralize the most dangerous pillboxes. On Omaha, Krupp-made concrete proves resilient but not invulnerable. The sea and sky work in concert. Naval and aerial bombardment soften the teeth at the line's edge, while infantry and specialized armor exploit openings. The Germans, for all their tactical skill, are being ground down by a combination of precision and relentless throughput. Richter is struck by the human detail of that grinding. He watches a young soldier, barely 20, trying to right a recoilless piece that has been knocked askew by blast. The boy's helmet is too large. His hands tremble. The veteran next to him, an infantryman who has seen Rostov and Kharkov, mutters a soft profanity and clamps both hands on the weapon. It is discipline held together by small mercies. Military bureaucracy, that great scaffolding of orders and forms, cannot reach into these micro-moments to fix a torn radio wire or restart a smashed howitzer. Only hands and sweat and grit can do that now. At midday, the naval bombardment grows more surgical. Battleships like the USS Texas and British cruisers have moved into positions dangerously close to shore. Their main battery fire is now aimed at specific fortifications. From Richter's slit, he can see the waves of smoke and dust where shells strike. Concrete mouths blown apart, embrasures cracked like eggshells. Ammunition points go dark. Guns that had been part of a system of interlocking fire are neutralized in series. The regiment's ADP, its ability to coordinate long-range fire, is eroded as observation posts are silenced. Each disabled post reduces the defensive net's ability to interlock, and the net begins to show gaping holes that the attackers thread like a needle. As the day lengthens, the strategy of attrition translates into a local, brutal arithmetic. A battery that might knock out a landing craft consumes thousands of rounds trying to stop the tide. The loss of a single gun is an exponential weakening because every position is part of a chain. For Richter and his men, the calculus is grim. Hold long enough to inflict maximum casualties, then retreat in order or die trying. Orders to retreat rarely come. The German command culture, stiffened by notions of honor and duty, prefers to hold ground until it can no longer be held. The cost is measured in living men. Communication with neighboring units grows thinner. A dispatch rider crashes his motorcycle in a shell-pitted lane and dies with helmet over his face. Radio operators in a forward command tent are buried in a collapsing roof after a direct hit. Supply lines are cut. Ammunition becomes the most precious commodity. Men begin to ration rounds not by doctrine but by hope. Fire 3 salvos only at the most critical targets. That rationing is not a tactical choice but a moral one. Use what you have to maximize pain to the enemy while keeping enough to defend yesterday's lines, which may already be lost. As afternoon darkens toward the late hours, a crucial turning point occurs in the pocket above Vierville. A small inlet, previously thought secure because of hidden bars and reefs, is used by assault engineers who have been trained to clear obstacles under fire. In a terrifying, intimate moment, a squad of U.S. Navy demolition teams, working alongside Army engineers, pulls up a previously ignored strand of mines and opens a route for follow-on units. The beachhead swells. Engineers ferry supplies and the first armored units, medium Shermans, begin to labor up improvised ramps and scrubby dunes. Armored platoons begin to punch into the flank of what the Germans had assumed would be a sealed battlefield. Richter sees the Shermans in silhouette, rugged, boxy tanks moving with the stubborn confidence of logistic-backed machines. He knows these tanks are not the equal of the heaviest German armor in pure technical terms, but he knows also that their presence is worse. Every Sherman is a replacement that will multiply across the line. He watches them push through dust and concrete, their tracks carving new realities into the French earth. For Richter, the sight of these tanks is again not just a tactical experience, but a symbolic demonstration of the war's new equation. A flood of material replacing the old primacy of individual battlefield brilliance. The position on the bluff becomes untenable as darkness nears. Shelling intensifies, overhead planes thrum, and the battery's firing arcs are compromised. A direct hit collapses the nearby magazine. The explosion sends a visible shockwave that tosses Richter to the floor and deafens him for a moment. When he picks himself up, the world is a mouthful of ringing and dust. Communication lines are dead. Fires burn where magazines once lay. His men are wounded. His telephone is a melted loop of plastic. Richter faces a decision that has been foisted on too many officers. Stay and honor a symbolic defense to the last, or attempt to withdraw to fight another day with whatever men can be gathered. He looks at the faces of his remaining non-commissioned officers, faces that have changed from years at war. There is no simple answer. Orders from higher command are impossible to extract. The notion of control is an illusion. He chooses survival, not out of cowardice but calculation. If the battery can be reconstituted inland, it might still serve a purpose. If it is annihilated, the men are lost. Under cover of dark, he gathers his staff, pockets maps and logbooks, and slips down a chewed service tunnel behind a curtain of smoke. As they withdraw, the bombardment continues like an unrelenting heartbeat. On the beach below, the Allied fight continues to unfold. Small, mortifying scenes of courage and despair that will be retold for decades. For Richter, the retreat is a shrinking of options into a single line. Lev, regroup, hope that the calculus of industry has an error. He knows it does not. The day has already changed the arithmetic of the war. Retreat, reconstitution, and the calculus of survival. They move inland like men carrying a rumor, shuffled, cautious, dragging the weight of the day in their shoulders. Richter's retreat is not a rout. It is a tight, deliberate withdrawal performed under the pressure of an enemy that can replace blood with steel. The chalk lanes they once used as paths of patrol are cratered, crisscrossed with scorched timber and the broken axles of carts. Smoke hangs low in the fields, a wreath that follows them. Around farmsteads, abandoned bicycles and children's toys lie where they were dropped. The normal life of Normandy has been rent and made strange. Richter's group, what remains of his battery command, falls into the rough geometry of German retreat doctrine. Small units retain local initiative. NCOs are expected to hold cohesion. Staff officers preserve maps and radios. They move by compass and by the hard-earned instinct of soldiers who have learned to read the countryside not for beauty, but for vulnerability. In the hedgerows, sniper fire occasionally twitches the air, a reminder that the enemy is not a distant ocean, but a presence now in the fields and lanes. Logistics becomes the religion of survival. Richter looks at his leftover supply lists as if they were talismans. He calculates the number of rounds remaining, the fuel in jerry cans sloshing half empty, the food tins enough for a handful of days if rationed. The means of tomorrow's fight are smaller now. 1 truck, 2 machine guns, a handful of men trained to move quickly and strike where necessary. Each resource is a decision point with moral cost. Leave a wounded man and keep mobility or attempt rescue and risk capture. These decisions are no longer abstractions. They are immediate and brutal. In the days after the landings, the 352nd, like many German formations along the Normandy coast, shifts from being an anchored defensive force to a mobile, evasive one. Command and control, once respected and linear, splinters into fragments. Supply depots become targets. Rail lines curl under air attack. The German army's internal contradictions. Centralized authority chained to political oversight. Constrain quick movement. Hitler's requirement for direct approval to deploy reserves handicaps the division of initiative. Meanwhile, Allied air dominance means daytime movement is lethal. Night becomes the shelter of movement. It becomes the agent of survival. Richter's mind keeps returning to the morning's image, the horizon packed with ships, and to the industrial truth that image represented. He hears the echo of naval gunfire still in his bones and sees in his imagination faraway factories spinning out metal like teeth of a great machine. When he maps the Allied advantage, it is not merely numbers on a page but a network. Ports, docks, railheads, refineries, and the factories that feed them. The hope among the German officer corps that a few decisive victories could overturn the material tide seems at this point more superstition than strategy. In the small towns and farmyards inland, civilians sift from the wreckage of D-Day. Some are stunned, some hostile, others cooperative. The German soldiers meet a Europe that has become a contested set of loyalties. Local guides, men and women who know the back lanes and hidden fords, become invaluable. They point the way to unmined tracks, to wells where water remains, to barns with room for men to sleep without sleep. The moral compromise of occupation is laid bare in these interactions. Richter notes the faces of those who help, a ledger of favors that may be repaid or punished later. He records civilian aid in a small field notebook. Such mundane acts are threaded into the larger tapestry of events and will complicate memoirs and recriminations later. As the first week bleeds into the second, the Germans attempt local counterattacks where possible, trying to retake threatened positions, or at least delay Allied penetration. These efforts are often improvisational, one battalion here, a platoon there, pieced together from units not designed to coordinate at speed. The result is a mosaic of desperate, sometimes effective actions that cannot be sustained. Armor held in reserve in the Pas-de-Calais remains mostly idle or misdirected. Hitler's directive and the Allied deception worked in tandem to misplace the German center of gravity. Where tanks do arrive, often through night maneuvers, they are frequently cut down by Allied air or snarled by the terrible geometry of Bocage country, the hedgerow maze that turns mechanized movement into a labyrinth of ambush. Prisoners are a constant, complicated presence. Allied medics, when they can, attend to wounded German prisoners with stoicism, bandaging, triage, and often a curt verbal exchange in halting language. Richter finds himself parrying a different kind of battle, the contest for morale. He sees men, hardened in campaigns across the Eastern Front, suddenly confronted by the mental calculus of being outproduced. Weary officers whisper about the factories of the United States, about American raw materials, about the relentlessness of an economy that treats men and machines as interchangeable inputs. This is not a new conversation, but its urgency sharpens in the aftermath of Normandy. Richter also watches the Allied logistical machine announce itself in small, pragmatic ways. By the third day, assault docks and temporary harbors, Mulberry harbors, begin to show their value. Where the Germans thought the Allies might be hamstrung for lack of ports, the Allies improvise. Ahead of Richter, convoys roll along hastily repaired roads. Fuel and ammunition are ferried in through makeshift supply lines. Every truck and every Sherman that rumbles past is another confirmation of the equation that choked German hopes. Production plus supply equals persistence. Frequent air raids keep pressure on German movement. Field ambulances and supply wagons that attempt daylight convoys are easy prey. Commanders like Richter learn the cost of visibility. He institutes movement under cover of darkness wherever possible, and he trains men to dig in, camouflage, and employ decoys. These are the tactics of a force losing ground but not yet defeated. Techniques of damage limitation. Yet after each successful delay, the Allied tide claims new lodgements and expands the perimeter, and the raw arithmetic of industrial throughput tightens the noose. As the weeks go by, the difference between tactical valor and strategic impotence becomes clearer. Small unit actions yield local reversals. Counterattacks retake a hill for a time, ambushes disrupt a column. Yet the strategic map is reshaped by ports seized, beaches secured, and roads repaired. The Allies, fueled by a global economy and a logistical doctrine that values redundancy, apply pressure across multiple axes. For Richter, the painful lesson is that battlefield excellence does not equate to endurance when the other side can weather attrition through production. One night, in a ruined farmhouse used as a billet, Richter opens a cigarette pack and finds the American logo inside. A small, banal symbol of an economy that reaches even into personal effects. He thinks about the young American crewmen he glimpsed on the beaches. The replacement depots behind them where wounded men are seen and set to rights. The workshops where Sherman tanks are mended and sent back to the line. He writes in his notebook a single line. The war now moves by factories, not only by men. It is a line that will inform a lifetime of reflection and haunt the diaries of men who survive. Turning points. The hedge, the tank, and the loss of initiative. The Bocage consumes time like a slow, patient animal. Thick hedgerows. Earth banks topped with ancient trees and an interlaced root system. Turn every advance into a series of micro-battles, each one a room with its own rules. In this broken landscape, motion is measured in yards and hours. Richter's division, accustomed to linear frontages, finds itself fighting for squares of ground. Infantry moves with probing bayonet-length tactics. Engineers crawl with satchel charges and wire cutters. Tank crews learn to treat every lane as a funnel of death. One afternoon, Richter is summoned to a forward command post where a meeting of officers sketches the status of pockets and routes. A map is pinned to a rickety table. Pins and red string mark Allied gains, arrows where the Shermans have punched through, and cross-hatched areas where German units have been cut off. Discussion is blunt. A young major, Major Hans Kessler, a career artillery officer, speaks in short sentences about fuel shortages and the problem of replacing a single damaged piece of ordnance. Klaus listens as Kessler outlines a proposal. Consolidate scattered companies into a mobile reserve to counterattack and seal penetrations. The plan is intelligent, but the raw materials are absent. No fuel, no coherent air cover, and pending orders from higher command render it aspirational at best. The first real collision between German armored doctrine and Allied production manifests in a corridor outside a small farm called La Rivière. Not far from the beaches, the men still call the place. Here, Shermans push along a repaired lane with engineers clearing mines. A Kampfgruppe of Panthers is reported moving to intercept, and for a time the Luftwaffe gleams as a potential equalizer. But as the German tanks roll into position, Allied fighter bombers punish the approach. Panthers bog on hedgerow banks, creating choke points. When the engagement begins, the technical mastery of German armor shows. A single Panther can take out several Shermans at distance, its long gun finding steel hulls with deadly efficiency. Yet every Panther destroyed is a strategic defeat that cannot be easily repaired. American replacement yards churn out Shermans with industrial regularity. When a Panther is lost, months of scarce steel and concentrated labor vanish from the German order of battle. The clash at La Rivière demonstrates a cruel asymmetry. Tactical victories accumulate on both sides in a staccato of explosions and short-lived maneuvers, but the Allies can accept loss as a cost of progress. German forces, meanwhile, suffer attrition at a tempo their industry cannot match. Between hedgerows and ruined villages, the attritional clock ticks for men like Richter. He watches crews salvage turret eyes and replace treads in farm courtyards, mechanics cursing and sweating as they try to restore mobility under the watchful eyes of men who know loss by count. Each repaired Sherman is a small miracle. Each lost Panther a strategic whole. In towns such as Sainte-Mère-Église and Saint-Lô, the struggle becomes civic and intimate. Churches and municipal halls are repurposed into makeshift command posts and casualty centers. Civilians, farmers, bakers, priests, are swept into the logistics of war. Richter finds himself writing requisition orders for hay and fodder, not out of comfort but necessity. Horses still pull artillery carriages in sections where fuel is absent and the landscape forbids wheeled vehicles. The coexistence of industrial mechanization and age-old practices is an odd patchwork. Motor transport in one valley, horse teams in the next. This juxtaposition stabs at the notion that modern warfare is uniform and clean. It is messy, hybrid, and profoundly human. The psychological toll deepens. Rumors circulate through the ranks that reinforcements are coming from the east, that a decisive armored thrust will soon reverse fortunes. Most rumors are the marrow of wishful thinking and morale maintenance. Some are orders that become impossible to implement. At night, under tarpaulins, soldiers swap stories of factories they have seen on leave in Germany, of trains passing with endless columns of armor. The cognitive dissonance is stark. Soldiers who have seen the material bounty of the Reich know the truth of scarcity and hypocrisies that sustain command rhetoric. One striking episode unfolds when a small detachment of American engineers, part of a larger Allied effort to clear pathways through the Bocage, attempts to dismantle a southerly ridge that has become a German strongpoint. The fight is close, visceral, fought with grenades and the short-range fire of pistols and submachine guns. A Sherman supports the engineers from a crossroad, its 75-meter cannon suppressing embrasures while infantry advances. The Sherman fires, takes hits, and pauses as crews scramble to knock out nearby foxholes. From Richter's perspective, now at a distance but still a witness in the broader theater, the sight reveals how combined arms break a point of resistance. Artillery and armor supporting infantry and engineers to create a local force multiplier. Yet the cumulative effect of these actions is not a German comeback. It is a reordering of the front into a ring of defensive memories. Each hill captured by the Allies becomes another node in their logistics network. Each cleared lane is another artery feeding supply to forward units. Richter's unit manages to execute several well-conceived counterattacks, driving Allied patrols back for brief stretches. These localized successes come at a terrible cost in lives and materiel. A platoon that advances at dawn might be too shattered to hold a ridge by dusk. The defensive architecture of the Atlantic Wall had been designed for a different calculus, a frontal repulse supported by interlocking fire. In Normandy's fractal battlefield, the wall is eaten around the edges. Political dynamics compound the military ones. Hitler's direct interventions, his insistence that no ground be yielded without explicit orders, trap commanders in a rigidity that costs lives. Local decisions that once might have gathered momentum are strangled by political oversight. German officers feel the ghost of doctrine. They are bound to positions not because those positions serve a coherent strategy, but because surrendering ground is treated as moral and political failure. Richter recognizes the absurdity, but also the force of institutional inertia. Armies do not give up easily because military surrender is a social and cultural rupture as much as a tactical one. Amid all this, the Allied logistical experiment blossoms. Mulberry harbors and prefabricated piers allow cargo to flow ashore beyond initial expectations. Over days, the fragile jetties prove robust enough to ship in fuel and vehicles at a rate that steadily improves the capabilities of beachhead forces. Every truck that crosses the riprap undermines the German attempt at local strangulation. For Richter, this is less a technical problem than an existential one. The enemy is learning to make his land into a workshop, a staging area, a place of production rather than merely a battlefield. By the third week, the net effect is visible on operational maps. The 352nd has been hammered. Its combat power is a shadow of its pre-D-Day shape. Units that fought brilliantly in the opening hours are now skeletal skeletons. The chain of command, once a confident column, has become threads. Richter writes an after-action note that is half report, half confession. The battle for Normandy will not be decided by a single day alone. It will be decided by the sum of supply and the capacity to endure loss. The insight is not new, but the evidence is now visible to those who can read it. Aftermath and reckoning. The morning the war changed, the days after the breach feel like a long, ledgeless descent. There is no single climactic moment, no thunderbolt that decides everything in a single act, but rather a succession of pragmatic, grinding moves that together reshaped the map of Europe. For Richter, these days are a ledger kept in small, precise entries. Casualties counted and recounted. Guns salvaged. Requests for fuel that go unanswered. He becomes an archivist of attrition, noting what is lost and what, by some fluke of fortune or guile, remains. One morning, moving cautiously along a mutilated lane to inspect a rear guard, Richter comes upon a small cemetery of abandoned vehicles. Tanks sit like dead creatures, racks of spent shells beside them, boots scattered like the aftermath of a sudden storm. A Sherman's turret, half buried in a ditch, tilts as if to offer one last salute to a landscape that will now be remade by the victor's hands. The sight produces an odd, private sorrow, less for the machines than for the men they carried. Each husk is a story. The American logistical triumph asserts itself in ways both banal and strategic. Field hospitals aggregate wounded and return those able to fight. Repair depots restore Shermans, and new formations march forward in a rhythm that upends German expectations. Supply nodes, hubs of fuel, ammunition, and food, act like centers of gravity. Once secured, they allow the Allied advance to radiate outward. The Mulberry harbors continue to function, and the artificial ports at Arromanches and Omaha become arteries of movement. Ships arrive in waves that seem endless. Docks unload, cranes raise, and roads get stronger. Each mile gained is another small, incontrovertible fact in a new arithmetic of victory. Richter's division is shifted, reconstituted in fragments. Men who survived D-Day are reshaped by it. Some hardened, some quieter, some simply older. The 352nd Infantry Division fights on in a series of bitter engagements, but the manpower and materiel deficits deepen. In letters sent home, few reach their destinations. Soldiers attempt to explain what cannot be explained. The day when the horizon became full of ships and their world reordered. Those letters, when they survive, become testimony not only to battle, but to the cognitive shock of being defeated by a system rather than merely by an opponent. There are moral reckonings as well. The Atlantic Wall, once narrated in Berlin as the guarantee of German security, is exposed as an instrument of propaganda as much as defense. Men like Richter, who had devoted their craft to the wall, now see it as an imperfect response to a problem that had long ago moved beyond fortifications and into factories, strikes, and shipping manifests. In quiet hours, he contemplates responsibility, the responsibility of command, of political leadership, and of the society that supported a regime promising destiny, while its institutions blurred under the pressure of war. On both sides of the conflict, survivors tell stories that will sustain national mythologies. American veterans remember the horror and heroism of Omaha. British and Canadian soldiers wear their own scars with pride. German survivors recount the exhaustion and betrayal of being outproduced. These narratives, each partial and each true in its own register, will shape collective memory for decades. For historians and for those who listen closely, Richter's view, an officer watching a horizon fill with steel, becomes a metonym for the broader transformation of modern warfare, the moment when industry trumped single battle genius. In the months following D-Day, as the Allied armies push inland and Paris is liberated, the shape of victory becomes clearer. The German army in the West fights on with indomitable resilience in some sectors and with pragmatic withdrawal in others. But the strategic picture, that of a Reich facing a coalition with unmatched industrial and logistical reach, hardens into inevitability. Richter survives through that summer and into the autumn, moving from one defensive assignment to another. He carries with him the image of the morning of June 6th, not as a single flash of doom, but as the day that revealed an arithmetic of defeat. Factories, docks, roads, and the inexorable ability to supply men in numbers. Years later, as the continent recovers and memory ossifies into monuments and textbooks, the men who face that incoming horizon tell their stories. Some frame it as betrayal by distant commanders, some as the impersonal fact of industrial modernity. For Richter, the explanation is simpler and crueler. The enemy could afford to replace what it lost. His side could not. The moral lesson is not only about arms and armor, but about choices societies make. About where they invest resources, whom they arm, and how they sustain war economies. The image of the sea filled with ships becomes a lasting symbol, not merely of invasion, but of a world whose capacity to produce had outstripped the old logics of warfare. On the beaches and in the bluffs, memorials will rise, names will be carved into stone. Historians will debate choices and commanders will be assessed. Yet in the bunker, in the thin, damp dawn that gave Richter his first definitive insight, there is a private truth that outlasts the rhetoric. The understanding that fate in modern war is mediated as much by the factory floor as by the courage of individual soldiers. Richter's notebooks, if they survive, become small artifacts of that realization. As the sun sets on the first month after D-Day, the fighting will still be savage, and the cost will still be counted in human terms that no calculation can render painless. But the larger shape of the contest is now evident. The Allies have entered a war of production and logistics that they can sustain. The German army can no longer match that tempo. For a professional soldier, disciplined, exact, and bitterly honest, the morning that began with mist over the channel and ended with a horizon full of ships is the moment when a private certainty became universal. The war in the West had, in essence, changed. The instruments of victory were not merely guns and bravery, but dockyards and assembly lines, and the Allies had more of them.